As Americans, we are taught from an early age to value the study of history as a vital part of our education and our identity as a nation. Study of the American West has been extensive. The number of books published is second only to those written about the Civil War. But within all those volumes, references to African Americans are extremely rare. Today, historians are rediscovering the contributions of African Americans, recognizing their impact as a people, and exploring race relations as they played out in the Wild West. In this 5-part series, Professor Quintard Taylor focuses on African American history in terms of forming communities, combating racism, and changing social and political patterns in the development of the American West. The African American West is presented by the University of Washington's College of Arts and Sciences and the UW Alumni Association. Major funding for this program was provided by Macy's, continuing its long-term commitment to promoting Black history by making this video series available to secondary schools throughout Washington State. Additional funding was provided by the University Bookstore and UW-Medicine. This talk tells the seldom-told story of the Western campaign in the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. Professor Taylor explores the consequences of that struggle to determine if indeed the quote-unquote beloved community, so often proclaimed by civil rights activists in Seattle, actually emerged in the West.
Good evening. My name is Chuck Bloomenfeld, and I'm president of the University of Washington Alumni Association. And I want to welcome you to the last of this wonderful series, the African American West, 1528 to 2000. As you know, this lecture series is co-sponsored by the Alumni Association and the College of Arts and Sciences. And it really helps fulfill part of our mission at the Alumni Association, which is to reach, connect, and celebrate alumni and friends of the university in a lifelong relationship with the university. And this is one of our longest running lecture series, and it's a great partnership that's been designed to further our mission. We now present dozens of lectures and events throughout the year to showcase our exceptional faculty and to give alumni and friends of the university an opportunity to be exposed to new ideas and fresh perspectives. It is my pleasure to introduce Quintard Taylor, our speaker. Currently, Quintard is working on a number of interesting projects. He is conducting a study of 20th century Black urban communities in the West, which will be published by the University of Arizona Press. He is also working on a documentary reader on 19th and 20th century African American history for the Thomson Wadsworth, a major publisher of college textbooks. In addition to these projects and doing these lectures, he is working on a collaborative project with Dr. Samuel Kelly, who is the first Vice President of Minority Affairs at the University of Washington. The work is tentatively titled Dr. Sam, the Biography of Samuel E. Kelly, Soldier, Educator, and Advocate. And it will chronicle his remarkable 80-year life and history, and a very important one to this community. These are wonderful examples of the breadth of work being done by Professor Taylor. During this series, Professor Taylor has provided us with a new context for understanding our past. He has shown how our region's inhabitants have dealt with the struggles and conflicts resulting from racial inequality, and we have also seen the influence of the many people who have made a difference, people who were able to surmount the challenges presented to them. Hopefully, Professor Taylor's message will give us all a better understanding of the challenges that still remain in our community. For this, we thank you. What we have learned will stay with us for years to come. And as I introduce Dr. Taylor and ask him to come to the podium, we have a little special gift for you tonight as a commemoration of this wonderful experience you've spent with us. Oh, my God. This is a two-hander.
Oh, boy. I hadn't expected this. I have to free my hands.
On behalf of all of the Alumni Association, the College of Arts and Sciences, all of the sponsors, and all of us, thank you very much for the time and effort and the wonderful breadth of knowledge you've provided us over these last weeks.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Oh, this is heavy. That's very kind. No, I hadn't expected that at all. Actually, it sort of got me off the track from all the things I was going to say. I think I'll just spend the rest of the time talking about the president and forget about the lecture. First of all, again, I am amazed to see so many people here. I'm glad that Chuck mentioned Sam Kelly, and I'm somewhat disappointed that Dr. Kelly is not able to be here tonight. He called me this morning. He's having some difficulties, some medical problems. He's 80 years old, and for the most part, he's pretty spry, but every once in a while, things catch up with him. And he called to tell me about his disappointment in not being here. Had he been here, I would have introduced him to all of you. Many of you know him. Many of you who've been around the university, at least since the 1970s, I'm sure, are aware of Dr. Kelly. He was quite a force, quite a presence on this campus. What you probably don't know is that he was also one of the first African-American officers in the Army to lead an integrated unit in Korea in the early 1950s. I think that's just remarkable. That's a big part of the story that we're going to tell together. Of course, we will also talk about his university years, and then finally, we will talk about the last 20 years in which he's been involved in a variety of projects, the most important of which is the Rosemary Anderson School in Portland, an alternative school for people who have difficulty in high schools and the like. Dr. Kelly has had a remarkable life, and I'm privileged to be able to help to share that life with all of you. I hope you will look forward to the biography, or excuse me, his autobiography, that, with any luck, will be finished by the end of this calendar year. Okay. If you've been following me closely, you know that I've been increasingly focusing my attention on Seattle, and tonight we are going to deal exclusively with Seattle. In many ways, Seattle really represents much of what happens, particularly in terms of the African-American civil rights experience in the West, and it also represents the dilemmas or the issues and the problems facing African-Americans in what I call the post-civil rights period. As you're going to see in a minute, I'm going to enter into a discussion, and I'll be honest with you, I'll be candid with you, with some trepidation, because it's a discussion of contemporary Seattle. This is history that was made within the lifetimes of all of you in this room. And indeed, many of you may have even been participants in this history. And so, of course, if I get it wrong, you'll well correct me. But I want you to be aware of the fact that history continues. It's not just about the 19th century. It's not just about now the 20th century. It's about a continuation of processes of development even into the 21st century. But where we want to start tonight, though, is the civil rights movement in the West, and in particular, the civil rights movement in Seattle. Americans remain fascinated by the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Our fascination for the era encompasses a search for its proper place in the nation's history. The civil rights movement has usually been portrayed as a period of Southern black political awakening, where new heroic figures such as Martin Luther King and Fannie Lou Hamer led campaigns which secured new laws ensuring equality and opportunity. And of course, we're reminded of these scenes, particularly this month, Black History Month. We know of Martin Luther King at the March on Washington in 1963 and his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. We also are reminded, or we should be reminded, of Birmingham in September of 1963, the violence that was going on, the violence that was directed against a number of civil rights demonstrators. Birmingham, of course, with its Bull Connor, Eugene Bull Connor, and the dogs, the police dogs, and the fire hoses. I would argue that this approach to the history of the period is not so much wrong as it's incomplete. The movement was not simply a Southern affair. It was not simply something that happened in the South. It was instead a national transformation, an energizing of small and large African-American communities in the North and in the West, as well as in the South, which pursued, obviously, national goals and had national leadership, but which also pursued a very distinctly local agenda as well. It was demonstrations in places like Spokane in 1964 and 1965, or Portland, Oregon, and of course, as you're going to see in a minute, Seattle, Washington. It was a campaign of ordinary people, and I want to emphasize this phrase, ordinary people, to end job bias or school segregation in their local communities as part of the national campaign, the national effort to eradicate racism and empower African Americans. Seattle, the city farthest removed from the Deep South, offers opportunities for analyzing this approach and for refashioning our views on the era. The Seattle movement, which was an entirely local effort mounted by African Americans and sympathetic whites and Asians in the 1960s, would simultaneously confront with direct action tactics the three major problems facing the black community at the moment: job discrimination, housing bias, and de facto school segregation. In the time that I have, I will briefly address problems 2 and 3. I will say at the onset that the campaign against housing bias seemed to be a victory. Indeed, in many ways, it was one of the most significant victories, not just for Seattle, but in the entire country in terms of the efforts to try to open up housing for African Americans. However, the problem of de facto school segregation continued to divide Seattle long after the official civil rights movement ended in 1970. Let me provide some background, and indeed, let me go back to the period that we talked about earlier. As we all know now, World War II initiated a rapid and continuous migration that would push Seattle's black population from 3,700 in 1940 to 37,000 in 1970, and ultimately to 55,000 in the year 2000. As we discussed last week, that influx heightened racial tensions between whites and blacks, but it also heightened racial tensions between blacks and Asians and various other groups, as African Americans waged a determined effort to make sure that they were included in the economy of Seattle. Yet Seattle was neither Mississippi nor Chicago. Unlike the South, black men and black women in Seattle could vote. Unlike the South, or for that matter, Oregon, Montana, and Idaho, there were no legally segregated schools, and there were no interracial marriage bans. As one observer of the period remarked, African Americans migrated to Seattle because it was the end of the line. There was no better place to go. But Seattle's liberal image masked deep-seated racial fears and anxieties. And I want to point you to the image that we have on the screen right now. Roger Sale is a professor. I think he's retired now, but he was a longtime professor in the English department, and many of you may be familiar with him. Roger Sale was also a civil rights activist. He was also a person who did what he could, and he did a lot to try to change the city, to try to make the city aware of racial inequalities. And look at his statement. I won't read to you that statement, but look at that statement, and look at the last sentence. In Seattle, the ignorance runs deep. Sale had something. I think he was on to something. And indeed, as you see as we work our way through this lecture, you'll see the ignorance in Seattle reflected in a variety of ways. White racism impacted Seattle's African American community in a number of various fashions. First, much of the poverty of the Central District rested on a foundation of job discrimination. Seattle's African Americans made surprisingly little progress during the 1960s, despite the city's Boeing Aircraft Company boom. And many of you probably don't remember the 1960s in Boeing, but Boeing expanded dramatically, expanded spectacularly. To give you an example, between January of 1965 and December of 1967, Boeing alone added 148,000 new jobs. 148,000 new jobs. Yet an estimated 3,000 blacks remained unemployed in the Central District, even as Boeing was expanding. A lot of African Americans will tell you, even to this day, that Boeing would recruit people from all over the country, but it wouldn't recruit in the Central District. It wouldn't hire African Americans in the Central District. In October 1967, at the height of the Boeing boom, black unemployment in Seattle stood at 10%, which was triple the rate for the entire city and a full percentage point above black unemployment nationally. In other words, African Americans simply weren't sharing in the prosperity that was generated by Boeing and various other companies in Seattle in the 1960s. But secondly, there was increasing ghettoization. In other words, there was an increasing concentration of African Americans in what I call the Central District. The African American population resided almost exclusively in a 12 square mile area in the center of the city. That area contained 85% of Seattle's blacks, including 3,000 African Americans who lived in substandard housing. Again, we don't think about this. We don't think about blacks in substandard housing when we think of Seattle, and yet this is the situation that was emerging. And of course, the growth of the ghetto would lead to the third major issue, the third major problem, the rise of de facto school segregation. In 1950, there were no predominantly black schools. Let me repeat that. In 1950, there were no predominantly black schools in Seattle. 10 years later, 80% of the black children attended school in the Central District, and 5 elementary schools were over 80% African American. 5 elementary schools were over 80%. And you can see the racial breakdown even in the high schools in Seattle in 1962. As a matter of fact, I want to show you this next slide. School segregation in Seattle, some of you may remember Philip Burden, a prominent attorney. Philip Burden talked about the issue early on, almost as soon as he arrived in 1948. He talked about the attempts to try to break down school segregation. This is an old problem. And as you can see, it's a problem that would extend well into the end of the 20th century. Seattle's black leadership eagerly challenged these problems, naively believing that a campaign of civil disobedience would usher in a new period of complete racial equality and opportunity. Indeed, this primarily self-appointed leadership cadre would, throughout the 1960s, determine the civil rights agenda for the Central District. They formed an organization that they call the Central Area Civil Rights Committee to coordinate the activities. And I should say, parenthetically, that this is a remarkable organization in and of itself. It's essentially the leadership of the NAACP and CORE and the Urban League coming together. Rarely in black America in the 1960s did this happen. But somehow or another, these people all got on the same page, as it were, to coordinate civil rights activities, at least for a while. Let me list some of these people, and I'll show you some of the faces. Edwin Pratt, Executive Director of the Seattle Urban League. The 3 ministers, Mance Jackson, Samuel B. McKinney, and John H. Adams. Mance Jackson, of course, of Cherry Hill Baptist Church, Samuel McKinney, of course, of Mount Zion Baptist Church, and John H. Adams of First AME. There was a woman involved, E. June Smith, who was president of the NAACP, and of course you see Reverend McKinney with the bullhorn over there at one of the early protests. And there was also Walter Huntley, and I won't show him right now. He comes up a little bit later in our discussion. But all of these men and June Smith were the core of this Civil Rights Committee. They were a group of activists who were determined to try to change the racial equation in Seattle. In 1973, in an interview 5 years after he left Seattle, Reverend Adams recalled the early days of the Civil Rights Movement. He said, quote, "By 1963, the Civil Rights Movement has finally leaped the Cascade Mountains." By 1963, the Civil Rights Movement has finally leaped the Cascade Mountains. Of the simultaneous campaigns waged by Seattle's civil rights groups in the 1960s, open housing was the most acrimonious and yet ultimately the most successful. Civil rights leaders argued that the city of Seattle would never live up to its liberal image unless and until African Americans could freely reside in every corner of the city. One black real estate agent described the situation thusly, and I'll let you read the statement. And I think he captured the essence of the dilemma for African Americans. African Americans were in effect flying like a fly, buzzing around in a closed jar. In other words, black people were going from place to place in the Central District because essentially we could live nowhere else. And let me give you another image that reflects on this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ennis Arden, or how many of you are familiar with racial restrictions. This is not Birmingham, okay? This is not Atlanta. These are restrictions in Seattle. And this was commonplace. Indeed, one of my colleagues, Jim Gregory, and his researchers have found that well over 85% of the land mass of Seattle was covered by restrictive covenants. What that means is that African Americans, and often it meant Jews, often it meant Asians, often it meant Latinos, various other groups, could not live in neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood. It's no accident, folks, that the Central District became the home of African Americans. It was one of the few areas in all of Seattle that wasn't covered by restrictive covenants. African Americans decided something needed to be done about that. In 1962, they urged Seattle Mayor Gordon Clinton to create the Citizens Advisory Committee on Minority Housing. That committee, to the surprise of the mayor, called for an open housing ordinance. And for those of you who are not familiar with, an open housing ordinance simply says one has the right to live anywhere in the city that one chooses. There cannot be racial discrimination to keep people out of certain areas of the city. When the city council delayed action on the ordinance for nearly a year, Reverend Samuel McKinney led 35 young people into the mayor's office for the first sit-in in the history of Seattle. This is July 1st, 1963. Reverend Mance Jackson spoke for the demonstrators and for the impatience of Black Seattle when he declared, "A paternalistic concept of human relations in this country is over. We don't need to be taken care of. We want to be equal participants in our own problem-solving processes." Open housing protests continued into the fall of 1963, and I show 4 images to show you the volume of protests. This was a major effort on the part of not just Seattle's blacks, but also a whole host of whites who were concerned about opening the city or allowing African Americans to live in any and all sections of the city. On October 20th, 2,000 people, about 25% of them white, came out in a blinding rainstorm to Garfield High School to hear the calls for an end to racial segregation in housing. Reverend Samuel Adams, who was one of the keynoters at that rally, reiterated a theme that was increasingly familiar in the city of Seattle. He said the anger and frustration of local blacks was growing and that there was a possibility of violence. But Seattle, unlike eastern cities, could solve its racial problems because its population was still small. Finally, at the last meeting in October of 1963, the City Council passed Seattle's first open housing ordinance. This new law made discrimination in housing by race a crime, punishable by a fine. Councilman Wing Luke, the only Asian American councilman, indeed only the first Asian American councilman to be elected on the mainland of the United States, was the person who introduced the measure. However, that wasn't the end of the story. Open housing opponents immediately instituted